The great chamber of the Galactic Council was the largest room ever built by intelligent beings. Its ceiling stretched so high that clouds sometimes formed inside it. 12 species had gathered here for thousands of years to decide the fate of the galaxy. Today they would witness something none of them expected. Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood at the human podium. She was 63 years old, with gray hair and tired eyes. She had served the council for 30 years. Her father had served before her, and his mother before him. For 300 years, humans had been part of this great assembly. They had helped build treaties, stopped wars, and connected species who could not understand each other. Today, Lena was going to end all of that. The vote had finished just moments ago. The council had decided to abandon the Galaxy, a small species on the far edge of the galaxy. A dying star was going to destroy their home world in 2 years. They had only discovered space travel 5 years ago. They had no way to save themselves. The Galaxy had begged for help. Moving their population would cost resources, yes. It would require ships and time and effort from many species. But it was possible. The council had the power to save 4 billion innocent lives. They voted no. The cost was too high, they said. The Galaxy were not important enough. They had nothing to offer the galaxy. It was sad, but it was not the council's responsibility. Alina had listened to every speech. She had watched representatives talk about budgets and efficiency. She had seen them calculate the value of 4 billion lives and decide the number was too low. Not one of them had spoken about right or wrong. Not one had mentioned compassion or duty. Now she rose to speak, and the chamber fell silent. Humans were known for their long speeches. They always had something to say, some compromise to offer, some solution nobody else had considered. The other species expected her to argue. They expected her to fight. She did neither. Alina pressed a button on her podium. Her voice carried across the massive chamber, translated instantly into 12 different languages. Humanity formally withdraws from the Galactic Council, effective immediately. She pressed another button, and her podium went dark. Then she picked up her bag and walked toward the exit. For a long moment, nobody moved. The words did not make sense. Species did not simply leave the council. When they were angry, they made demands. They threatened. They negotiated. They stormed out of meetings only to return the next day with new proposals. They did not quietly say goodbye and walk away. High Counselor Zorith, a tall being with blue skin and 4 arms, finally found his voice. Ambassador Vasquez, please. Let us discuss this. Surely there is some arrangement we can reach. Alina stopped at the door. She did not turn around. There is nothing to discuss, Counselor. We are not angry. We are not making demands. We are simply leaving. But why? Asked Counselor Mirathan, a small creature covered in soft fur. She had voted to help the Galaxy. She had argued for compassion. She had lost. Alina turned her head slightly. Because we finally understand. We have spent 300 years believing that if we worked hard enough, if we showed you what kindness could accomplish, you would learn. We were wrong. You do not want to learn. You want us to carry the weight while you count your profits.
This is absurd, Zorath declared.
His voice was confident, but his 4 hands were shaking. The galaxy functioned perfectly well before humans arrived. It will function perfectly well after you leave. Lena smiled, but there was no happiness in it. Yes, Counselor. I am sure it will. She walked out of the chamber. The doors closed behind her with a soft sound that somehow felt louder than any explosion in the days that followed. Human delegations across the galaxy began packing their belongings. They did not argue with anyone. They did not explain themselves further. They simply gathered their things and left. The council sent messages demanding explanations. Humans replied politely that they had already explained. The council sent messages offering negotiations. Humans replied that there was nothing to negotiate. The council sent messages threatening consequences. Humans did not reply at all. Zora called an emergency meeting. This is clearly a strategy, he told the other counselors. Humans are emotional creatures. They are trying to make us feel guilty so we will give them something they want. We must not show weakness. Several counselors nodded. This made sense to them. Every species had tried such tactics at some point. You pretended to leave so others would beg you to stay. It was an old game, but Counselor Marathan was not so sure. She had studied humans for many years. She had lived among them during her youth. She knew something the others did not understand. Humans did not bluff. When humans said something, they meant it. When they made a promise, they kept it. When they said they were leaving, they were leaving. This was not a game to them. This was a decision. We should take this seriously, she told the council. Humans are more important to our operations than we realize. We should examine exactly what they do for us before we dismiss their departure.
Hey!
Zorath laughed. What do? They talk. They smile. They attend meetings and shake hands. Any species can do these things. Marathon wanted to argue, but she did not have proof. Not yet. So she stayed silent and began her own investigation. 1 week later, the first problems appeared. A trade dispute between the Krethian Empire and the Sindari. Collective had been scheduled for human mediation. Without humans present, both sides refused to speak directly. The meeting collapsed. Accusations flew. Old insults were remembered. A shipment of medical supplies meant for the outer colonies was delayed. The routing system used human-designed protocols that nobody else fully understood. The supplies sat in a warehouse while administrators argued about paperwork. A translation error between two species caused a diplomatic incident. Humans had always caught such errors before they became problems. Without them, the mistake went unnoticed until it was too late. Zorath dismissed each problem as coincidence. Small matters, he said. Temporary difficulties. The galaxy would adjust, but Marathon saw the pattern. She began counting all the small things humans did. The list grew longer every day, and she began to feel afraid because she realized the truth that Zorath refused to see. The humans had not been guests in the galactic community. They had been the foundation holding it together. And now that foundation was gone, the galaxy was about to discover what happened when the people who quietly solved all the problems simply walked away. The first disaster came not with weapons or war. It came with paperwork. 3 weeks after humanity's departure, the Central Trade Authority collapsed. This was the office that managed shipping routes between 100 different worlds. Every day, thousands of cargo ships needed permission to travel, documents to carry goods, clearance to land. The system had worked smoothly for 2 centuries. Nobody had realized that humans ran it, not officially, of course. On paper, the authority was managed by a committee of 6 species. But humans had designed the computer systems. Humans had written the procedures. Humans had trained every administrator. And when those humans left, they took their knowledge with them. The committee tried to continue operations. They failed within days. Ships were stuck in ports. Goods rotted in warehouses. Factories shut down because materials never arrived. Counselor Zorath called it a temporary setback. He appointed new administrators and demanded they fix the problem. But the new administrators did not understand the systems. The manuals were written in human English, filled with references to other manuals that nobody could find. Meanwhile, Counselor Marathon continued her investigation. Every day she discovered something new, something worse. Humans had managed the emergency response network. When disasters struck, humans coordinated rescue efforts between species who normally could not work together. Without them, a mining accident on a Krethion moon killed 300 workers who could have been saved. Humans had maintained the translation protocols. The automatic systems that allowed different species to understand each other were human inventions. Small errors began appearing. Misunderstandings multiplied. Humans had run the scholarship programs that brought young beings from poor worlds to study at great universities. Without human administrators, the programs stopped. Thousands of students were sent home with no explanation. The list went on and on. Humans had done so much, asked for so little, and nobody had noticed. They were like air. Nobody thought about air until it was gone. But the worst news was yet to come. Marathon finally obtained access to diplomatic records between the Krethian Empire and the Sindari Collective. These two species had hated each other for 1,000 years. They had fought 17 wars. They had killed billions of each other's people. For the last century, they had maintained an uncomfortable peace. Everyone assumed this was because both sides had grown tired of fighting. Everyone was wrong. The peace existed because of humans. Human diplomats had spent decades building connections between moderate leaders on both sides. They had created back-channel communications that let enemies talk without admitting they were talking. They had arranged small acts of cooperation that slowly built trust. When tensions rose, humans intervened quietly. A word here, a meeting there, a compromise nobody else could have suggested. The peace was not natural. It was maintained by constant human effort. That effort had ended. Marathon rushed to inform the council, but she was too late. Krethian warships had already crossed the border into Sindari space. An ancient hatred was waking up, and there was no one left to calm it down, far away from council space. In a quiet corner of the galaxy, something else was happening. The Veluxi homeworld was dying. The star that gave them warmth was expanding, growing hotter every year. Soon, their oceans would boil. Soon, their atmosphere would burn away. The council had refused to help them. But the council was not the only power in the galaxy. Human ships began arriving at the Veluxi homeworld. Not warships. Cargo vessels. Colony transports. Medical frigates. They came without announcement, without demands, without asking for anything in return. Human engineers worked with Veluxi scientists to prepare the evacuation. Human doctors treated the sick. Human teachers helped Veluxi families understand what to expect on their new home. A young Veluxi named Kethra asked a human worker why they were helping. The human, a middle-aged woman with calloused hands, looked confused by the question. "Because you need help," she said simply. "What other reason could there be?" Kethra did not understand. In his experience, help always came with conditions. Powerful species helped weak species in exchange for loyalty, resources, or political support. Nobody helped for free. But the council said we are not worth saving, Kethra said. They calculated the cost and decided we do not matter enough. The human woman sat down next to him. She was tired. She had been working for 18 hours, but she took time to answer. "The council counts everything in terms of profit and loss," she said. "They look at you and see a small species with nothing to offer. But we look at you and see people. Children who want to grow up. Parents who want to protect their families. Artists and dreamers and builders. How do you calculate the value of that?" Kethra thought about this for a long time. Finally, he asked, "Is that why you left the council? Because they do not see what you see?" The woman smiled sadly. "We left because we spent 300 years trying to teach them to see, and they refused to learn. We cannot force people to be kind. We can only show them what kindness looks like and hope they choose it for themselves. What if they never choose it? Then we will be very sad. But we will keep being kind anyway, because that is who we are." Back on the council homeworld, Marathon made a discovery that changed everything. She found records showing that human withdrawal was not a sudden decision. They had been planning it for 50 years, quietly, carefully, without telling anyone. Humans had been preparing for this moment. They had built independent supply lines that did not rely on council infrastructure. They had relocated their most important assets to systems outside council control. They had trained the Veluxi and other abandoned species to survive without galactic support. This was not an emotional reaction. This was a carefully executed plan that had been decades in the making. Marathon sat alone in her office, surrounded by evidence of human planning. She finally understood the terrible truth. Humans had always known the council would fail them eventually. They had stayed anyway, hoping they were wrong. They had worked and served and sacrificed, giving the council every chance to prove itself worthy. The vote on the Veluxi had been the final test, and the council had failed. Now the humans were gone, and they were never coming back. Not because they were angry, Not because they wanted revenge, they were gone because they had finally accepted that some students do not want to learn. And Mirathon was terrified of what that meant for everyone they left behind. 3 months had passed since humanity walked away. High Counselor Zoroth sat in his private office, staring at a screen filled with unanswered messages. He had sent 17 communications to Earth. Formal requests, informal appeals, carefully worded apologies, desperate pleas. Each one disappeared into silence. Not a single response. Not even an acknowledgement that the messages had been received. The silence was worse than anger. Anger could be negotiated with. Anger meant the other side still cared enough to fight. But silence meant something far more terrible. It meant they had stopped caring at all. Outside his window, the council homeworld continued its daily business. But everything was different now. The streets that once buzzed with activity from dozens of species were quieter. Human restaurants had closed. Human shops stood empty. Human music no longer played in the public squares. Most species had not liked humans very much. They found them too emotional, too idealistic, too focused on fairness instead of profit. But now that humans were gone, everyone realized how much color they had brought to the galaxy. The war between the Krethian Empire and the Sindari Collective had grown worse. Border skirmishes had become full-scale battles. 3 star systems had been devastated. Millions of civilians had fled their homes. Both sides wanted human mediators. Both sides sent requests to Earth. Both sides received the same response. The Council had received silence. An old Krethian general, one who had worked with human peacekeepers for decades, finally received a different answer. A human diplomat he had known for years sent him a single sentence. "We trusted you to be better than this. We were wrong." The general shared this message with his government. Some leaders were angry. How dare the humans judge them? Who did humans think they were? But others felt something different. Shame. Humans had believed in them. Humans had worked for years to help them find peace. And they had thrown it all away the moment humans stopped watching. What did that say about them? Meanwhile, the galactic economy continued to crumble. Humans had been the connective tissue that held everything together. They traded fairly with everyone. They carried goods for small profits. They extended credit to species that had nothing to offer except promise. Without them, wealthy species grew wealthier while poor species struggled. Trade routes favored those who could pay the highest fees. Development programs shut down. Young species that had been growing toward prosperity found themselves abandoned. The Valoran Confederacy, a powerful alliance of 12 worlds, began questioning council leadership. Why had they let humans leave? Why had they not negotiated? Why had they abandoned the Veluxi? The Oryx Dominion asked similar questions. So did the Trellian networks. So did a dozen other powers who had always assumed the council knew what it was doing. Zoroth had no answers. The truth was too embarrassing to admit. They had never negotiated because they never believed humans would actually leave. Every other species, when upset, made demands. They threatened and postured and eventually accepted a compromise. Humans had done none of these things. They had simply said goodbye and walked away. And nobody knew how to respond to that. Counselor Mirathon decided to take action. She traveled to a neutral space station on the edge of Council territory, hoping to find some connection to humanity. The station had once been a busy trading hub. Now half its shops were closed. She wandered the quiet corridors for hours until she found what she was looking for. A small restaurant, still operating, owned by a human. The owner was an old man named Marcus. He had lived on the station for 40 years. When the withdrawal order came, he had stayed behind. This was his home, he said. He was too old to start over somewhere else. Mirathon sat at his counter and ordered tea. For a while, they did not speak. Finally, she gathered her courage. "I need to understand," she said. "Why did you really leave?" Marcus poured her tea slowly. His hands were wrinkled but steady. "You already know why." "I want to hear you say it." The old man sighed. He had been asked this question many times in the past 3 months. He was tired of answering. But something in Marathon Seas told him she was different. She actually wanted to learn. Do you know what my grandmother told me? Marcus said. She served on the council 100 years ago. She told me that humans joined the council because we believed in its potential. We saw 12 species who had stopped fighting each other. We thought that was the beginning of something beautiful, was it not? Marcus shook his head sadly. You stopped fighting because you were tired, not because you had learned that fighting was wrong. You created the council to protect your own interests, not to help others. We spent 300 years trying to show you a different way. We thought if we worked hard enough, if we showed you what compassion could accomplish, you would change. No, you let us do the work of being good while you continued being selfish. You used us as your conscience, so you did not have to develop one of your own. Marathon felt tears forming in her eyes. She wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. What do you want from us now? She asked. Marcus looked at her with something like pity. We do not want anything from you. That is what you do not understand. We are not angry. We are not punishing you. We are just done. Done. Done carrying people who do not want to walk. Done teaching students who do not want to learn. Done believing in people who refuse to believe in themselves. He refilled her tea. His voice grew softer. We are not your parents, counselor. We are not responsible for making you be good. We showed you the path. We walked beside you as long as we could. But eventually you have to choose to walk on your own. And you chose not to. Marathon sat in silence for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was small. Can we earn your trust again? Can we prove we have changed? Marcus smiled, but it was a tired smile. That is not the right question. The right question is, can you prove it to yourselves? Can you be good when nobody's watching? Can you help others when there is no reward? Can you choose kindness simply because it is kind? He leaned forward. We will be watching from afar. We hope you succeed. But we cannot walk this path for you anymore. You have to choose it for yourselves. That night, Marathon returned to the council. She had not found a solution. She had found something more important. She had found understanding, and she knew that the galaxy's problems would not be solved by begging humans to return. They would only be solved when the council finally became what humans had always believed they could be. The question was whether that was still possible, or whether humanity's faith had been misplaced from the very beginning. The council chamber had never felt so empty. 6 months ago, this room had been filled with confident voices debating the future of the galaxy. Now half the seats were vacant. Representatives had been called home to deal with crises. Others had resigned in disgrace. Few had simply stopped coming, unable to face the growing disaster. High Counselor Zoreth stood at the central podium, looking older than he had ever looked before. His blue skin had grown pale. His 4 hands trembled constantly. The confidence that once defined him had disappeared. The war between the Krethian Empire and the Sindari Collective had spread beyond all predictions. What started as border skirmishes had become total war. 3 star systems lay in ruins. The death toll had passed 50 million and was climbing every day. Refugees fled in all directions. Millions of beings who had lost everything were looking for safety. They overwhelmed space stations. They crowded into ships that were never meant to hold so many. They begged for help from anyone who would listen. The council tried to respond. They activated the emergency response systems that humans had built. But nobody fully understood how those systems worked. Commands were entered wrong. Resources were sent to the wrong locations. Ships meant to carry food carried medical supplies instead. Ships meant to carry doctors carried construction equipment. Human-designed system that could have saved millions was failing because nobody had bothered to learn how it worked. Planet Verdaxis, a refugee camp, held 200,000 beings from both sides of the war. Krethians and Sindari, enemies for 1,000 years, were forced to live side by side. Everyone expected violence instead. Something unexpected happened. The younger generation refused to fight. Young Krethians and young Sindari had grown up during the century of peace. Many had studied at universities where human teachers taught them about cooperation. They had learned to see each other as individuals rather than enemies. When their elders demanded hatred, they responded with confusion. Why should they hate people they had grown up beside? Why should they continue a war that their grandparents had started? The older generations were shocked. They had expected their children to carry on ancient grudges. Instead, those children asked questions nobody wanted to answer. Similar scenes played out across the war zone, not everywhere, not with everyone, but enough to matter. The century of human influence had planted seeds. Those seeds were finally beginning to grow. Back on the Council homeworld, Zorath received a message he had been dreading. The Valoran Confederacy was considering withdrawal from the Council. So was the Oryx Dominion, so were half a dozen other powers. The great galactic structure that had stood for millennia was falling apart. Zorath knew it was his fault. He had dismissed human concerns. He had mocked their idealism. He had assumed the galaxy would continue functioning without them. He had been catastrophically wrong. In desperation, he made a public broadcast. His image was transmitted to every world in Council space. His voice reached billions of beings. Citizens of the galaxy, he began. I speak to you today with humility and regret. We made mistakes. We let our friends leave without understanding what they gave us. We abandoned people who needed our help. We chose profit over compassion. He paused. His voice cracked. I am asking humanity to return. Whatever you want, we will give. Whatever changes you require, we will make. Please come back. We need you. The broadcast ended. Zorath waited for a response. Days passed, then weeks. Nothing came. Humanity was not coming back. Counselor Marathon had known this would happen. She had tried to warn Zorath, but he had not listened. Now she watched him crumble and felt no satisfaction, only sadness. She spent her days studying the documentation that humans had left behind. Before departing, they had created detailed records of every system they managed, instructions for every process they had developed, explanations of every relationship they had nurtured. At first, Marathon thought this was simply professional responsibility, humans cleaning up after themselves. But as she studied the documents more carefully, she realized the truth. This was a gift. Humans had left everything the Council needed to succeed without them. They had written guides that any species could follow. They had created training programs that required no human involvement. They had designed systems that could be maintained by anyone willing to learn. They did not want the Council to fail. They wanted the Council to grow up. One document in particular caught Marathon's attention. It was titled simply, What We Hoped For. The document was short. It explained why humans had joined the Council 300 years ago. It described their dreams of a galaxy united not by fear, but by genuine cooperation. It outlined their belief that every species had the potential for greatness if given the chance to develop it. The final paragraph made Marathon cry. We did not leave because you needed us. We left because you forgot that we were trying to teach you to not need anyone. A child who depends on their parents forever is not successful. Success means growing into someone who can stand alone and choose to stand with others anyway. We wanted to give you that gift. We still do, but we cannot give it if we never leave. Marathon shared this document with the remaining Council members. Some were moved, others were angry. A few dismissed it as human sentimentality, but a young counselor named Withdrew read it differently. He was newly appointed, replacing a predecessor who had resigned in shame. He had no investment in the old ways. He saw things with fresh eyes. What if we stop asking them to come back? He said quietly. The other counselors stared at him. The idea seemed impossible. What if instead, Withdrew continued, we try to become what they believed we could be, not for them, for ourselves. For the galaxy, Zorath shook his head. We cannot do what humans did. We're not like them. No, Withdrew agreed. We're not. But we can learn to be better than we were. We can study their methods. We can adopt their principles. We can choose to be kind, even when it costs us something. He stood up. He was young and uncertain, but his voice was steady. Humans believed in us for 300 years. They saw something in us that we could not see in ourselves. Maybe it is time we tried to find it. The chamber fell silent. For the first time since humanity's departure, Someone had suggested a path forward that did not involve begging for help. It was a small moment, single voice speaking against despair. But small moments can change history, and somewhere far away. Watching from the shadows, humans saw what Withdrew had done. They saw a young being stand up and choose hope over fear. They saw exactly what they had always believed was possible. They smiled, and they waited to see what would happen next. 1 year had passed since humanity walked away from the Galactic Council. The Great Chamber was full again, not with the old representatives who had failed so spectacularly, but with new faces. Young counselors who had grown up in a different galaxy. Leaders who understood that survival required change. Counselor Withdrew stood at the central podium. In 12 months, he had risen from unknown newcomer to one of the most respected voices in the chamber. Not through politics or manipulation, through something simpler. He told the truth. Even when it hurt, today the council faced a vote that would define its future. A species called the Morith Collective was dying. Their sun, like the Veluxy sun before it, was killing their world. They had come to the council begging for help. 1 year ago, the council would have calculated the cost and voted no. The Morith had nothing valuable. Saving them would drain resources. It was economically inefficient. Today, Withdrew asked a different question. What kind of beings do we want to be? The chamber was silent. He continued. 1 year ago, we abandoned the Veluxy because helping them cost too much. Humanity left because they could no longer respect what we had become. We lost our friends. We lost our stability. We lost parts of ourselves that we are still trying to recover. He looked around the room at the new generation of leaders. The humans did not leave because we made one bad decision. They left because that decision revealed who we really were. We were people who calculated the value of lives and decided some were not worth saving. He pointed toward the Morith delegation sitting in the visitor gallery. Small beings with large eyes. Terrified beings who had traveled across the galaxy hoping for salvation. Today we have a chance to prove we have changed. Not to the humans, to ourselves. The cost of saving the Morith is high, but the cost of abandoning them is higher. It is the cost of becoming the species the humans always feared we would be. He stepped back from the podium. I vote yes. Let history judge what the rest of you decide. The vote was called. One by one, representatives registered their decisions. Yes, yes, yes. No, yes, yes. When the final count was announced, the result was unanimous. Every single representative had voted to save the Morith for the first time in galactic history. The council had chosen compassion without human guidance. They had done it because it was right, not because someone was watching. In the visitor gallery, the Morith delegation wept with relief. They had expected rejection. They had received grace. Counselor Marathan personally led the relief effort. She had spent the past year studying human methods. She understood now how to coordinate dozens of species toward a common goal. She knew how to cut through politics and focus on what mattered. The evacuation of the Morith homeworld took 18 months. It was difficult and expensive and exhausting, but every single Morith was saved. Not one life was left behind. The war between the Krethian Empire and the Sindari Collective had ended 6 months earlier, not through outside mediation, through exhaustion and shame and the growing voices of young people who refused to hate. The peace treaty was negotiated by diplomats from both sides, who had been trained by human teachers decades ago. They remembered lessons about patience and compromise. They applied what they had learned. The treaty was not perfect. Old wounds did not heal overnight, but it was a beginning. And beginnings were enough. Across the galaxy, species began adopting what they called the human approach. Fair trade instead of exploitation, patience instead of aggression. Genuine interest in others instead of calculating what they could gain. Not everyone changed. Some species clung to old ways. Some leaders resisted reform. Progress was slow and uneven and frustrating, but it was progress. Real progress. Earned progress. Former High Counselor Zorath spent his final months in office working to repair the damage he had caused. He traveled to the Veluxy colony world to apologize personally for the Council's abandonment. He met with war refugees and listened to their stories. He admitted his mistakes publicly and repeatedly. On the day he retired, he gave a final speech. "I was a fool," he said simply. "I thought power meant never admitting weakness. I thought leadership meant never bending. The humans tried to teach me a different way. I refused to learn. That refusal cost millions of lives and nearly destroyed everything we had built." He bowed his head. "I cannot undo what I have done. But perhaps my failure can serve as a warning to those who come after. Do not be like me. Be like the humans. Be like what they believed we could be." The Council officially renamed its humanitarian doctrine. It would be called the Vasquez Principle after the human ambassador who had stood in this chamber and quietly said goodbye. The principle was simple. Every life has value that cannot be calculated. Marathon wondered what Elena Vasquez would think of the honor. She decided to find out. It took months of searching, but eventually she tracked the former ambassador to a small moon in an unimportant system. Vasquez had retired there. She spent her days gardening and watching the stars. Marathon traveled to the moon alone. She found Vasquez kneeling in a flower bed, hands covered in dirt, completely at peace. "Ambassador Vasquez," Marathon said softly. Alina looked up. Her hair was completely white now. Her face was lined with age, but her eyes were still sharp. "Just Alina now," she said. "I am not an ambassador anymore." They sat together in the garden. Marathon told her everything that had happened. The reforms, the Morith rescue, the peace treaty, the Vasquez principle. Alina listened without interrupting. When Marathon finished, she smiled. "Will humanity return to the Council?" Marathon asked. Alina was quiet for a long moment. She looked up at the stars. "We never really left," she said finally. "Every teacher who inspired a student, every diplomat who showed enemies how to talk, every worker who demonstrated that kindness was possible. We planted seeds across the galaxy for 300 years. Those seeds are finally growing." She turned to face Marathon. "The question was never whether we would return. The question was whether you would become people we could return to. And it seems you have." Marathon felt tears on her face. "So you will come back?" Alina smiled and shook her head. "Not yet. Not for a long time. You are still learning to walk. If we return too soon, you will lean on us again. You need to stand on your own first. Prove to yourselves that you can be good without us watching." She reached out and took Marathon's hand. "But someday, when you are ready, we will be there. Not as teachers. Not as conscience. As equals, as friends. As family." 1 year later, a young Veluxy named Kethra entered the council chamber as his species' first representative. He had grown from a frightened child into a confident diplomat. Human teachers had helped him find his voice. When asked what had inspired him to pursue diplomacy, he answered without hesitation. "A human teacher once told me that the greatest strength is not forcing others to change. It is showing them that change is possible and trusting them to choose it." He looked around the chamber at the gathered representatives. "Humanity chose to trust us. They believed we could be better, even when we gave them no reason to believe. They left so we could learn to stand alone. And we did." He placed his hand over his heart. "This is what humans taught us. Not through words. Through example. Through patience. Through faith that seemed foolish until it was proven wise." The chamber erupted in applause. Species that had once dismissed humans as emotional and weak now honored their memory. The galaxy had changed, and somewhere on a quiet moon, Alina Vasquez tended her garden, listening to the stars. She had spent her life planting seeds. Now, finally, she was watching them bloom. The galaxy was growing up. And humanity, patient as always, was waiting to welcome them home.